The night was suffocating. Fog clung to the trees like a shroud, and the wind whispered secrets that no one alive dared repeat. In the heart of Virginia, 1828, a breath occurred that would unsettle the fragile minds of the locals, and eventually shake the foundations of what they believed about life, death, and the unseen threads that bind them. A child came into the world, not crying with the innocent wail of a newborn, but with a voice older than the bones of its mother. Think carefully about that. A voice carrying centuries in its tone, an understanding, a weight, and a knowing no infant could naturally possess. This was not the kind of story whispered around the hearth for amusement. The midwives, hardened by years of witnessing the chaos of human birth, recoiled, their hands trembling as the child spoke first words that no mother should ever hear from the mouth of her own child. The words themselves were ordinary, but the cadence, the authority, the consciousness behind them, unnatural. They carried the weight of secrets older than the Virginia soil they walked upon. And here's the first thing they never tell you. History is written by those who survive, those who control the narrative, those who suppress what cannot serve their version of reality. A child with a voice older than its mother would not survive public curiosity. The whispers in the night, the questioning eyes of neighbors, the slow gnawing fear, these were forces far more lethal than any blade. That child, in truth, was never meant to be acknowledged. But the universe, indifferent to human control, often leaks truths in the most inconvenient places. And sometimes, those leaks are so profound, so destabilizing, that they echo for centuries. It is said that some people are born with the ability to pierce the veil, the thin membrane between the living and the hidden. They see patterns others cannot. They hear truths we are too weak to confront. This child, this anomaly of flesh and consciousness, was one of those rare beings. And from the very first moment, the world began to recognize something had shifted. Something that would expose the silent corruption of institutions, the lies embedded in traditions, and the psychological control mechanisms humanity has been blindly following for centuries. If you think you can step back and observe safely, you are already too late. The story you are about to hear is not mere folklore. It is a portal into the machinery of hidden power, a reflection of how much they fear the awakened mind. And that child, speaking in tones older than any of us could comprehend, was the first alarm. By morning, the house had become a silent prison. Curtains drawn tight, doors barred not against intruders, but against witnesses. In 1828 Virginia, reputation was survival, and survival depended on obedience, to church, to state, to tradition. Anything that threatened those pillars was treated like a contagion. The mother understood this instinctively. She did not need to be told. The moment her child looked into her eyes, not with need, not with confusion, but with recognition, she felt the ancient fear rise in her chest. Not fear of death, fear of exposure. The child did not babble. It did not stumble over language. It spoke in full cadence, measured and deliberate, as if remembering rather than learning. And the words it chose were not childish. They were observant, corrective, at times, condemning. When the local pastor was summoned under the pretense of blessing the newborn, the child addressed him by a name he had never spoken aloud, a name known only to the man and to God, or so he believed. The pastor went pale. His prayer faltered. His hand shook. This is where the record fractures. Official church documents from the county show a sudden gap. Baptism records missing. Journals torn out. A fire later accidentally destroys the parish archive. But fear leaves fingerprints even when ink is burned. Testimonies pass quietly through families, never written, only whispered. The child spoke of events before they happened. It referenced decisions made in closed rooms, behind locked doors, among men who believed secrecy was protection. Here is the truth hidden in plain sight. Institutions do not fear violence nearly as much as they fear awareness. A weapon can be taken. A rebel can be killed. But a voice that reveals the structure of power itself, that is intolerable. That voice threatens the illusion that authority flows downward from heaven rather than upward from manipulation. The child's voice did not scream. It did not rant. It calmly named patterns. It explained consequences. It spoke of cycles, how empires rot from the inside, how moral language is used to disguise control, how obedience is trained through fear long before it is enforced through law. These were not prophecies. They were diagnostics. And that is what terrified the most. Not that the child sounded old, but that it sounded correct. Men who had never met gathered and agreed without speaking openly. The church, the county elders, the landowners, they shared a silent understanding older than any written constitution. Anomalies must be contained. Truth must be managed. And whatever this child was, it could not be allowed to speak freely. This is how suppression begins. Not with chains. With concern. Not with violence. With protection. And once you recognize that pattern, you begin to see it everywhere, even now. The first winter of the child's life was a crucible. Virginia's cold seeped into the bones of those who tried to control it. Yet no fire could thaw the unnerving clarity the child projected. Neighbors who came to visit reported a presence in the room that was not human. Some swore the child looked into their souls as if reading ledger books, cataloging every hidden thought, every suppressed desire, every lie they had told themselves to survive. Adults felt stripped bare. The elders of the town began avoiding the house altogether. But fear, as always, has its subtler methods. The mother, initially stunned, began to feel the psychological weight of being tethered to someone who could see too far, understand too much. Sleep became impossible. Her mind, once anchored in the mundane, began to fracture. She whispered to herself at night, "It is just a child." But the voice in response, the one that spoke with the wisdom of lifetimes, reminded her that perception itself could be a prison. At this point, we must acknowledge what history so carefully omits. Children like this are not anomalies by accident. They are signals. They are warnings. And the institutions that feel threatened by them, whether churches, governments, or families, respond first with containment, then with rewriting reality. The local magistrate, summoned to ensure propriety, declared the child normal, healthy, and yet noted in private journals that the boy did not cry as infants do, but spoke of truths too heavy for the earth. The townsfolk, left outside the house, filled the void with stories, rumors of witchcraft, curses, and unholy pacts. These tales, though dismissed publicly, worked as a control mechanism. People told themselves lies to explain what their senses could not rationalize. Fear became a collective shield, blinding them to what was actually in their midst. Here is what is never written in textbooks. Human perception is not reality. History is curated by those who fear understanding. And the child's voice was not just a warning, it was a mirror. It reflected back the decay and corruption inherent in those who thought themselves moral or powerful. By the time the child could walk, its language had become a compass pointing toward forbidden knowledge. It would ask the unspoken questions. Why do you obey what you do not understand? Why do you serve masters who fear the truth? Why do you let fear decide who lives and who dies? The adults, hearing these questions, recoiled as if struck, for they recognized in them the pattern of control that had shaped their entire lives. And yet, this is only the beginning, because knowledge, once spoken, cannot be unspoken, and those who sought to contain it were about to face a choice that would reveal the machinery of power in ways no one expected. By the spring of 1829, the whispers had grown into calculated action. The elders no longer simply avoided the house. They began to orchestrate a system of subtle coercion. Invitations to social gatherings vanished. Tradesmen refused work. Even neighbors once friendly became distant, their smiles brittle, their eyes furtive. This was not random fear. It was strategy, a psychological containment designed to isolate the child and, through the mother, to control the anomaly before it could influence others. What most do not understand about fear is that it thrives not on violence, but on compliance. If the child had been taken by force, the town would have risked scandal, curiosity, exposure. Instead, they built invisible walls. They used every subtle tool at their disposal: shame, exclusion, rumor. By 1830, the mother lived in a bubble of suffocating solitude, forced into complicity with a secret she could neither share nor fully comprehend. The child, however, remained unbroken. And here's the first key revelation they never tell you. Power respects only two things: obedience and knowledge. Those who hold neither are either destroyed quietly or ignored until convenient. This child had knowledge, far beyond ordinary comprehension, and could not be contained by obedience. Every attempt to bend it, to suppress its awareness, failed silently, leaving behind a trail of unnerved adults and fractured authority. Visitors who dared enter the house reported the same unnerving phenomenon. A simple conversation with the child could leave them unable to sleep, haunted by truths they did not want to know. One magistrate recorded in a private diary that the child spoke of events I had only ever whispered in thought, as if reading the ledger of my soul. And this is the dangerous part. The truth has a weight. Once encountered, it cannot be unseen. Those who try to erase it become themselves conduits of fear and corruption. By now, rumors began to take on a life of their own. Some claimed the child's voice had the cadence of ancient scholars. Others whispered of forbidden knowledge passed through bloodlines lost to history. But the deeper truth, intentionally hidden by historians, is this: the anomaly was a mirror to every hidden system of control, the invisible chains that shape obedience, the silent fear that enforces conformity, the psychological manipulation woven into family, church, and government alike. And this is why the adults acted with such coordinated precision. They were not cruel. They were afraid. They understood that the child could unravel the carefully constructed illusions of authority. And in that unraveling, everything they had built to manage reality could collapse, not with a battle, but with understanding. The stage was set. The forces of control, ancient and deliberate, began to converge. And the child, speaking with a voice older than its mother, remained the only true observer in a town built on fear and lies. The first public moment came unexpectedly. A traveling preacher had been invited to the town, unaware of the anomaly that lay in the modest Virginia home. Curious neighbors, hoping for a spectacle or reassurance, gathered outside the window, whispering prayers to protect the natural order. The preacher entered, expecting a simple blessing, and was met instead by the child's gaze, a gaze not of infancy, but of calculation, observation, and knowing far beyond its years. The child spoke immediately, in a voice that seemed to reverberate through the bones of the room. "You teach what you do not understand," it said. "You claim to serve God, yet fear the truth of your own deeds. How many of you hide sins behind ritual?" The preacher froze. His mouth opened, then closed. Words of blessing and ritual caught in his throat. The villagers outside pressed closer to the glass, unable to tear themselves away. This was not prophecy. It was diagnosis. The child named patterns of corruption, spoke of subtle manipulations, and dissected motives that even the wisest adults had never dared examine. Every listener felt the cold hand of their own complicity brush against their spine. Fear rose, not of death, but of revelation. For the first time, they recognized that authority is only as solid as the ignorance of those it commands. And here's the most important detail: they never tried to silence the child with force at that moment. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they began orchestrating a network of influence, a psychological cage woven of social expectation, rumor, and subtle threats. Families were warned quietly. Tradesmen were advised to avoid the house. Even the preacher, once he regained composure, spread tales framed as cautionary fables. The child was peculiar, gifted, dangerous, never revealing the full truth of its speech. You must understand the pattern here. Containment in plain sight. The anomaly was not imprisoned by walls, but by minds. Fear and social expectation became the chains. And those who observed, who felt the unsettling weight of the child's words, began to unconsciously police themselves. Every glance, every hesitation, every silent thought became a thread in the invisible cage. This is the mechanism that repeats through history. Those who awaken to forbidden truths are not eliminated with obvious violence. They are contained, manipulated, and rendered invisible through the subtle architecture of fear and compliance. The child of 1828 Virginia became the first conscious experiment in such containment, a living testament to how knowledge disrupts power, and how power, in turn, fights back quietly but relentlessly. By the time the sun set on that day, the town had been irrevocably changed. And yet, the most terrifying revelation had only begun to unfold. The child was aware of the forces arrayed against it, and it had begun to speak directly to them. Isolation is a weapon far deadlier than any sword. By midsummer, the child's mother began to feel its invisible edge cutting into her life. Friends and neighbors, once casual, now vanished as if swallowed by the earth. Deliveries of goods were delayed. Invitations to gatherings ceased. Gossip, like poison in water, flowed through the town, never directly, but always enough to ensure she knew that the world was closing in. Subtle pressure, invisible but relentless, was the method chosen by those who understood that overt action would draw attention. The child, however, was not unaware. From the very beginning, it understood patterns of control. It spoke not only to the mother but to the walls, to the shadows, as if conversing with forces beyond perception. They fear what they cannot measure, it said, and they will act against what they cannot define. But fear alone is predictable. Watch, and they will reveal themselves. The mother, exhausted, began documenting the events in secret, though she knew her writings could be destroyed or misinterpreted. In her journal, she wrote of whispered threats from neighbors, unexplained absences of travelers, and the quiet but deliberate interventions by the town's ruling figures. Every act of avoidance, every unexplained disappearance, every subtle correction of her behavior was a thread in the web. And yet, even in isolation, the child's presence radiated certainty, a knowing beyond human comprehension, a force that made even the most careful manipulation insufficient. This is where history bends and hides the truth. Suppression is not only about removing a person, it is about eroding reality itself, shaping perception so completely that the anomaly seems impossible or imaginary. And yet, paradoxically, the closer they moved to suppress the child, the more it revealed. The child's observations became sharper, its speech more precise, its ability to expose the hidden intentions of men and women more dangerous to those who believed they were in control. By the end of that summer, the child had begun using its voice strategically, not simply to speak truth, but to provoke awareness, to test limits, to expose patterns of control in real time. Conversations in the town shifted. People began questioning their own motives, their compliance, the chains they had accepted silently. Fear rippled, but so did curiosity. The child had become both the lens and the mirror, showing the town not just its anomaly, but the machinery of domination itself. And here lies the crucial point. Those who understand manipulation must also recognize that it can be reversed. Knowledge, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. Every subtle control imposed upon the mother and child only amplified the awareness that the town had been constructed on illusions, lies, and fear. And in that awareness, the seeds of reckoning were planted. The confrontation was quiet, almost imperceptible. The town elders, emboldened by collective fear, arranged a meeting in the dimly lit parlor of the family home. They spoke in tones of civility, words carefully chosen to appear benign, but every phrase was designed to test, probe, and intimidate. They believed that by confronting the child together, they could assert the invisible hierarchy they had maintained for generations. They did not realize the error they had made. The child did not recognize hierarchy in the human sense. It recognized patterns, and it saw theirs clearly. "You speak of what you do not understand," one elder began, attempting authority. The child tilted its head, eyes piercing. "And you pretend to understand what you refuse to see," it replied, each word measured like a scalpel against their fragile composure. The room went still. Not a single adult could look the child in the eye without feeling their own concealed intentions reflected back. What had been subtle pressure, whispers, and avoidance now became raw exposure. This is where the mechanism of control falters. Humans can manipulate perception, enforce compliance, and hide intentions, but when confronted with a mind that discerns patterns beyond fear, beyond ritual, beyond custom, all authority evaporates. The elders, though physically unchallenged, were mentally unarmed. The child spoke of alliances, secret decisions, and moral compromises that had never left closed doors, as though reading the ledger of their souls. And here lies a forbidden truth. Power is never absolute. It relies on the ignorance and obedience of those it governs. Remove either, and it begins to crumble silently. That day, the elders realized their authority was a fragile facade, one that could not withstand the analytical, penetrating gaze of a consciousness unbound by age or tradition. The child did not argue. It simply named patterns. It revealed the invisible architecture of control they had assumed attainable. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with fear compounded. The elders left the house pale, their carefully constructed social networks suddenly suspect in their own minds. They had glimpsed a reflection of the mechanisms they had wielded so effectively, and for the first time, recognized that those mechanisms could be turned against them. And this is the lesson hidden in the shadows of history. When knowledge awakens within the wrong vessel, the strongest institutions, the church, the courts, the social hierarchy, cannot resist. Fear alone is insufficient. Deception becomes transparent. Control collapses under the weight of clarity. The child had not yet acted. It had merely observed and spoken. Yet that was enough to begin destabilizing an entire system built on silence and compliance. The elders convened again, this time in secrecy, behind closed doors that smelled of candle wax and aged wood. Their fear had evolved into strategy. Violence was risky. Exposure could destroy their reputations and unravel the town's delicate social equilibrium. Instead, they chose the subtler, more insidious route: psychological warfare. Isolation, gaslighting, and whispered rumors would become their arsenal. The mother and child were not merely inconvenient. They were a threat to the entire framework of control that had governed the town for decades. Letters were intercepted. Neighbors were persuaded to withdraw invitations, delay services, and speak as though the family had become odd, even cursed. Tradesmen, fearing the elder's silent judgment, avoided the household. Slowly, meticulously, the child's world contracted. The town created an invisible cage, and the mother, trapped between the love for her child and the pressure of authority, began to falter under the weight of social isolation. Every day was a careful negotiation with fear, a battle fought in whispers, glances, and half-truths. But the child was not passive. It noticed the patterns immediately. "They measure fear," it told the mother, voice calm, eyes reflecting understanding beyond its years. And in their measurement, they reveal their own weakness. The words were simple, but their meaning was profound. Every act of control left behind a signature, a fingerprint of intent. The elders believed they were shaping reality, but in truth, they were exposing themselves. Every subtle manipulation, every lie whispered under the guise of concern, became a map of the power structure, one that the child could navigate and exploit without violence. And here's the deeper truth the town could never admit. Control built on fear is inherently reactive. It is fragile. Its strength depends entirely on the compliance of those it subjugates, and the moment that compliance falters, the entire structure begins to wobble. The child's voice was not loud, not aggressive. It was precise, analytical, and aware, enough to make adults question their assumptions, doubt their authority, and reconsider every silent compromise they had made. By autumn, the pattern was unmistakable. The town's efforts at containment had failed to extinguish influence, they had amplified it. The whispers of fear among the elders were now coupled with self-doubt, suspicion of one another, and a creeping awareness that their network of control was being methodically unraveled from within. The child, speaking in tones older than its mother, had become a catalyst, exposing the invisible mechanics of power, manipulation, and compliance to anyone willing, or forced, to listen. The first battle of psychological supremacy had begun, and the outcome, while not yet visible, was already shifting the balance of unseen authority in ways that would echo far beyond that house in Virginia. The first deliberate challenge came at the Harvest Festival, a cornerstone of social order. The town relied on these rituals not for celebration alone, but to reinforce hierarchy, obedience, and collective identity. Every gesture, every toast, every orchestrated dance was a lesson in conformity. The child, however, arrived with no understanding of social fear, only awareness of patterns. And for the first time, it chose to speak, not privately, not subtly, but publicly. As the elders watched, tense and calculating, the child turned to the gathered crowd and said, "You honor the earth while ignoring the rot in your own hearts. You praise diligence while punishing those who see clearly. You celebrate unity while tolerating lies that bind you to illusion." The words were soft, yet carried authority far beyond the child's appearance. Adults froze mid-motion. Conversations faltered. Laughter died in throats. The rituals themselves seemed to hesitate under the weight of observation. Here is a truth that will never be printed in polite history. Rituals are designed to mask reality. They create the illusion that behavior is voluntary when, in fact, it is conditioned. The child, by simply speaking truth aloud, broke the spell. And the elders understood instantly that what was at stake was not the comfort of the festival, but the stability of a system they had carefully constructed over decades. The town had been trained to obey silently. The child had undone that training in a single, pointed moment. The reaction was swift, but subtle. The elders whispered behind cupped hands. Invitations to the house were rescinded. Tradesmen were told, in quiet tones, to avoid any interaction. Gossip intensified. The mother felt the isolation deepen, a suffocating fog of silent coercion settling over her and her child. But the child remained unshaken, observing the mechanisms of control with a clarity that grew sharper with every act of suppression. And here's the deeper lesson. Those who control through fear are themselves prisoners of the pattern. They act not out of strength, but out of the compulsion to maintain an illusion. Every whisper, every subtle act of intimidation, reveals more than it hides. The child, in public defiance, had illuminated not just the fragility of authority, but the invisible threads that manipulate behavior, the psychological architecture of compliance. By the festival's end, the elders had achieved nothing but awareness of their vulnerability, and the child, calm and composed, returned home with the mother, leaving behind a crowd of adults who now questioned everything they had once taken for granted. Knowledge, once spoken aloud, cannot be silenced. The first overt crack in the town's carefully maintained order had appeared. By winter, the elders escalated their campaign. Isolation had failed. Public exposure had failed. Now they deployed deception and rumor with precision, crafting a narrative that would erode both credibility and will. Letters, supposedly from concerned outsiders, circulated. Whispers of the child's unnaturalness reached distant relatives. Friends were subtly warned, beware the house where the child speaks as if centuries old. The strategy was not violence. It was a psychological assault, designed to fracture the mother's trust in herself and her child. The child, however, perceived every layer of manipulation instantly. It spoke to the mother. They do not fear me. They fear themselves. And in their fear, they reveal every intention, every weakness, every thread they cannot control. Watch closely. Learn. The voice, steady and timeless, offered not comfort, but understanding, the kind of understanding that awakens awareness. Every whisper, every avoidance, became data. Every subtle act of pressure became a map of power. This is where history, as it is commonly told, lies. They describe strange children or peculiar families, but they omit the machinery of containment. Suppression rarely takes the form of brute force. It is patience, subtlety, and omnipresence. Isolation is methodical. Reputation is weaponized. Compliance is enforced by social pressure. And yet, the child, an anomaly of voice and perception, remained unbroken, observing patterns and naming truths aloud that adults had never allowed themselves to acknowledge. Neighbors began to question their own perceptions. Did they really hear the child's words, or did their own fear amplify them? The mother recorded the patterns, not for posterity, but for survival, an archive of manipulation unfolding in real time. Every subtle threat, every carefully whispered warning, every sudden absence of a familiar face was catalogued, examined, and understood. The child was not merely reacting, it was learning, adapting, and, in ways unseen, shaping the narrative of control itself. By the end of the winter, the psychological landscape of the town had shifted. The elders' authority, once absolute, now trembled in silence. Every act of manipulation had left fingerprints that the child could see. And more than that, it had taught the mother something dangerous, that awareness itself is a weapon. Knowledge, once comprehended, cannot be unlearned. Authority, once exposed, cannot fully recover. And here's the truth they feared above all. The strongest chains are forged from compliance, and when compliance falters, control collapses, not with violence, but with insight. The child's voice, older than its mother, had begun to dismantle the invisible architecture of dominance, one subtle revelation at a time. Spring arrived, and with it, a new audacity. The child, no longer content to remain passive under the weight of silent oppression, began addressing the institutions themselves. The church, the magistrate's office, the town council, all pillars of authority, were subtly named and exposed in the child's observations. You preach virtue, it said to a visiting minister, yet your ledger hides debts of conscience. You call obedience holy, but it is fear you cultivate. How long before your own lies consume you? Adults felt their control unravel in real time. Words that should have been dismissed as childish were reverberated with undeniable precision. The child spoke not to insult, not to provoke, but to illuminate the machinery behind every act of manipulation. Every careful rule, every whispered warning, every hidden agenda became transparent. It was as if the child held a lantern above the town's unacknowledged corruption, forcing it into the open. And here's the lesson no history book admits. Truth destabilizes. Institutions, no matter how venerable, depend on unawareness, obedience, and repetition. When confronted by knowledge that cannot be ignored, they falter. The town elders realized, in quiet panic, that their subtle manipulations were insufficient. Isolation, rumor, and social pressure had only revealed the fragility of their control. The child's voice, older than its mother, was now a vector of systemic exposure. The mother watched this unfolding with a mixture of awe and terror. She understood the danger, but also the power. In a whispered conversation, the child said, "Control is a pattern, not a person. Observe it, name it, and you hold it in your hand. Fear is only a measure of obedience." These words were not idle. They were a blueprint for perception, a methodology for seeing through every veiled act of dominance, manipulation, or suppression. By mid-spring, the town's psychological equilibrium had shifted. The elders' network of influence trembled under scrutiny, their reputations and relationships subtly corroded by insight they could neither fully understand nor counter. People began questioning the motives of authority figures, whispering doubts in private, while public compliance continued only as a mask. The child had become both the catalyst and the mirror, showing the hidden patterns of control and the internal corruption of those who wielded it. And this is the dangerous truth, the kind that changes a man forever. Awareness alone can dismantle structures built over generations. You do not need armies. You do not need weapons. All that is required is vision, and the courage to name what others fear. The child, speaking in tones older than its mother, had begun to teach the first lesson of forbidden knowledge, that control is always conditional, and the truth, once spoken, can never be fully contained. By mid-year, the town elders were making mistakes. Fear, once a tool, had become a trap. Their carefully constructed network of influence began to crack, revealing blind spots the child had already mapped. Subtle threats became overt, whispered warnings transformed into accusatory glances, and private conversations leaked into the streets as rumor. Every action intended to suppress or intimidate only amplified the visibility of the power structures they sought to protect. The child watched it all, speaking sparingly but with devastating precision. "You act from fear," it said to the mother, "and fear always exposes the mind that harbors it. Observe carefully, they will betray themselves in their own attempt to control you." And so they did. A magistrate, in a private meeting meant to strategize containment, inadvertently revealed the depth of his collusion with neighboring towns, exposing networks of influence, favoritism, and moral compromise. A preacher, trying to intimidate with scripture, admitted in a whispered aside that he feared the child's voice more than God's judgment. Here lies the subtle mechanism of corruption and control. The higher the perceived authority, the more fragile it becomes when exposed. Human institutions are not designed to endure scrutiny. They are designed to perpetuate illusion. And when confronted with a mind that sees clearly, every carefully maintained facade begins to crumble. The child, in observing and naming these cracks, became a force that no adult could fully anticipate or contain. The townspeople, too, began to feel the unease. Their own compliance, once automatic, faltered in private moments. They glimpsed the patterns of manipulation in their daily lives, how fear dictated behavior, how respect was manufactured, how obedience had been trained long before understanding. Some began questioning their own actions. Others, too frightened to act, fell silent. The child had achieved something profound without confrontation, the awakening of perception. And here is the dangerous truth. Knowledge alone is subversive. Awareness destabilizes systems, fractures authority, and forces hidden agendas into the open. The child's voice, older than its mother, had become a vector of systemic truth, a lens through which the town's concealed corruption could be seen and understood. Fear, which had long been the currency of control, was now the instrument of its unraveling. By the end of that season, the child had not only survived the mechanisms of suppression but had begun to reverse their effect. The observers, the elders, the ministers, the magistrates, were now the observed. Their every misstep, every fear-driven act, became evidence of the fragility of human power. And in that quiet, relentless observation, the first irreversible cracks in the town's psychological hierarchy began to appear. By late summer, the child's influence extended beyond the confines of the household. Those who had glimpsed its clarity began to carry fragments of its insight into the streets, the markets, and the church pews. Conversations shifted subtly. Whispers that once reinforced compliance now questioned it. Fear and authority, once absolute, wavered under the weight of a perception that refused to obey. The child had not acted violently, had not demanded obedience, yet entire patterns of social control trembled before a voice that refused to conform. Even ordinary townspeople, previously blinded by ritual and habit, began to notice discrepancies. A neighbor caught in a lie about a neighborly favor felt the sudden awareness of accountability, as if unseen eyes weighed the truth of each action. Another, who had long hidden debts of conscience behind polite smiles, felt a subtle, unnerving exposure. And all of this originated from a child who spoke not to punish, but to illuminate, naming patterns of deceit, omission, and self-deception with a precision that stripped adults of their comfort. Here is a lesson history hides. Influence is rarely exerted through force. The most powerful acts of transformation are invisible, quiet, and psychological. The child became a catalyst for systemic awakening, revealing that compliance is conditional and that awareness, once introduced, cannot be contained. Even those who feared the child secretly admired its clarity, a dangerous combination that destabilized traditional loyalty and obedience. The elders recognized this immediately. Their whispered council meetings became frantic. Strategies of subtle coercion, which had worked in private, now failed in the public eye. Every rumor intended to discredit the child bounced back, revealing the duplicity of those who tried to manipulate it. Fear no longer silenced the anomalous, it amplified its reach. The child, older in voice than in years, became a lens through which the town could see the machinery of control that had governed them silently for generations. And here is the pivotal insight: the awakening of perception is contagious. One mind, unbound by fear, can illuminate patterns invisible to hundreds. And once illuminated, those patterns cannot be unseen. The child, without raising a hand, without demanding compliance, was reshaping the social consciousness of a town, revealing the invisible chains that bound them, and forcing the first cracks in institutional authority to appear. By the season's end, the town teetered between tradition and awareness. The elders' silent control had been challenged, obedience had been questioned. Fear was now a mirror reflecting the fragility of authority. And the child, ever calm, watched as perception shifted, knowing that knowledge had become the most dangerous force in Virginia since the founding of the county itself. The child began to take a more deliberate role in shaping awareness. It spoke to the mother, teaching her to observe without judgment, to name patterns of control, and to recognize fear as a tool rather than a natural reaction. They act from ritual and habit, not conviction, the child said. Their power is only as real as your belief in it. Watch. Listen. Learn. Awareness is the weapon they cannot anticipate. Soon, select townspeople who had glimpsed the truth began seeking subtle guidance. They came quietly, under the guise of casual conversation, but the child discerned their intentions immediately. With measured words, it guided them in recognizing manipulation in their own lives, in the words of the magistrates, in the unspoken hierarchies of social gatherings. Each lesson was small, almost imperceptible, but cumulative, creating ripples through the network of influence that the elders believed secure. Here is the first dangerous insight: awareness is contagious. Once one mind perceives the machinery of control, it begins to see it everywhere. The child's influence spread not through force, but through subtle instruction, making observers conscious of fear, obligation, and deceit where previously they had acted blindly. Those who learned from the child began to question, to analyze, to resist, not outwardly yet, but internally. The elders noticed these shifts but could not identify their source. Patterns of compliance that had once been automatic began to falter. Tradesmen who had once feared repercussions now hesitated, speaking more honestly, acting more deliberately. Even members of the clergy found themselves doubting their rituals, sensing inconsistencies in behavior and doctrine that had been invisible until the child's lens revealed them. And here is the central lesson: systems of control are only as strong as the minds they shape. Remove the unseen fear, and the entire apparatus weakens. By teaching perception itself, the child was dismantling authority without confrontation, revealing that knowledge, when shared, spreads faster and more destructively than any act of rebellion. By the end of the season, a small, silent network had formed, a collection of eyes and minds aware of the patterns, silently resisting the unseen force of obedience. And all of it began with a voice older than its mother's, a consciousness that understood the architecture of power and the fragility of fear. What had begun as an anomaly in a single household was now the seed of systemic awakening. The elders, sensing their influence slipping, escalated their measures once more, but their attempts were clumsy, desperate, and entirely predictable. They introduced rules under the guise of morality, subtle threats disguised as concern, and social pressures cloaked in tradition. Each intervention, carefully calculated, backfired spectacularly. The child anticipated every move, responding not with defiance but with observation, naming the invisible mechanisms behind each act, exposing the patterns for anyone willing to notice. The townspeople began to recognize the orchestration. "Why are we whispering behind closed doors?" they asked quietly among themselves. "Why do our elders act as though fear is the only currency?" Subtle doubt, once planted by the child, grew exponentially. Authority, which had thrived on unquestioned obedience, now faltered under scrutiny. The elders' attempts to reassert control illuminated the very fractures they sought to conceal. Here is the fundamental truth the town could not admit. Authority depends entirely on perceived inevitability. Once the illusion falters, fear loses power. The child, older in voice than its mother, had already shifted perception. Its calm articulation of patterns forced adults to confront their complicity, to recognize the invisible threads of manipulation, and to understand the fragility of their social hierarchy. Authority could no longer operate unquestioned. The child began to guide the mother and a few brave observers in subtle ways, teaching them to recognize and counter the psychological architecture of control. Notice every hesitation, every whisper, every act designed to manipulate, it instructed. These are the signatures of fear, the fingerprints of authority. They are predictable, and predictability is power if you understand it. Slowly, an underground awareness emerged, a quiet consciousness among those who had the courage to see beyond ritual, tradition, and obedience. By autumn, the town had entered a new phase of instability. The elders, frustrated and increasingly paranoid, misjudged every reaction. Missteps became common. Rumors intended to suppress instead amplified doubt. The child's influence, subtle yet pervasive, had reached critical mass. Adults began questioning the very foundations of obedience, recognizing that the system they had believed eternal was vulnerable to insight. And here's the most dangerous secret. Change does not require armies or revolution. It requires perception, guidance, and awareness. The child had taught the first lessons of forbidden knowledge, that control is conditional, that fear is manipulable, and that insight can dismantle power without confrontation. What began as an anomaly in a single household was now awakening a consciousness capable of challenging centuries of unseen authority. The child did not rush exposure. It waited for pressure to peak, because that is when systems reveal their true shape. Then it began orchestrating moments, small and precise, like pulling threads from a tapestry until the pattern could no longer hold. A comment placed at the right gathering. A question asked where silence had always been expected. A truth spoken just loudly enough to be heard by the wrong ears. Each act forced institutions to respond, and in responding, to expose themselves. At a council meeting meant to reaffirm order, the child spoke through another's mouth, not possession, but influence. A townsman repeated a question he did not realize he had learned. Why do our laws protect reputation more fiercely than truth? The room froze. The elders deflected, but the hesitation was visible. The pause was the signal. Once hesitation appears, authority begins to rot from the inside. The church followed. A sermon intended to restore fear instead revealed desperation. Scripture was twisted into threat, morality into obedience. And the child, observing quietly from the back, spoke afterward to a small circle. When faith becomes control, it is no longer sacred. When obedience replaces conscience, corruption is complete. Those words move faster than the sermon ever could. This is how institutional collapse actually begins, not with rebellion, but with recognition. The child understood something ancient and forbidden. Systems fall when they are forced to explain themselves. Power survives in silence. Once questioned, it weakens. Once observed, it panics. By now, the elders were no longer united. Suspicion infected their ranks. Each feared the others would be exposed first. This is the final stage of control failure, when the architects turn on one another. And the child did nothing to stop it. It merely watched, catalogued, understood. The mother realized then what had truly been born. Not a prophet. Not a curse. A diagnostic mind. A consciousness designed to detect corruption the way fire detects oxygen. Wherever power hid behind tradition, the child's voice stripped it bare. And here's the truth meant only for those ready to hear it. The world does not change through force. It changes when men learn to see. When patterns become visible. When fear loses its invisibility. The town of Virginia, 1828, had become an experiment. One that history buried because it worked too well. Institutions exposed themselves. Authority collapsed inward. And a child with a voice older than its mother proved what they never want you to know. Control only exists until you recognize it. By the time winter returned, the town no longer recognized itself. Not because buildings had burned or blood had spilled, but because belief had shifted. And belief is the true infrastructure of any system. The child understood this long before the elders ever sensed it. Power had not been attacked. It had been observed. And observation is corrosive. Men who once enforced silence now hesitated before speaking. Women who had swallowed fear's virtue began to question the cost of obedience. Even children, especially children, noticed the cracks. They asked questions adults had trained themselves not to ask. Why must we listen? Why is truth dangerous? Who decides what is allowed to be known? These questions did not come from rebellion. They came from clarity. The elders attempted one final maneuver, reframing. They declared the child unwell. Not evil. Not cursed. Unstable. This is the oldest tactic in the book. When truth cannot be disproven, its speaker is pathologized. Awareness becomes illness. Perception becomes madness. And history quietly nods along. But something unexpected happened. The label didn't stick. Too many had already seen. Too many had felt the accuracy of the child's words land with surgical precision in places no rumor could reach. The attempt to medicalize awareness only revealed desperation. And desperation always exposes the lie beneath authority. The child spoke once more, softly, to a gathering that had not been planned. When a system calls clarity a sickness, it is confessing its own corruption. No anger. No defiance. Just a statement of pattern. And the effect was irreversible. Here is what the records never say out loud. The town did not destroy the child. The town dissolved around it. Authority lost cohesion. Institutions became hollow shells, still standing but no longer believed. And belief, once withdrawn, never fully returns. The mother watched as the final illusion fell away. She understood now why fear had followed the child from birth. Why suppression had been instinctive. Why silence had been enforced with such precision. The child was not dangerous because it spoke ancient truths. It was dangerous because it taught others how to see them. And that is the threshold. Once crossed, there is no return to comfort. No return to ignorance. No return to obedience without awareness. This is where the story stops being about a child in 1828 and starts being about you. History will tell you the child vanished. That records go quiet. That the family moved on. This is the language of erasure. Clean, polite, final. But disappearances in controlled systems are rarely physical. More often, they are narrative. The story is sealed, archived, mislabeled, and buried beneath more comfortable truths. And once buried, it becomes harmless. Also they believe. The child did not flee. It withdrew. There is a difference. Retreat is fear. Withdrawal is strategy. By the time official attention turned outward, when neighboring towns began asking questions, the anomaly had already completed its function. Awareness had been seeded. Authority had been destabilized. The diagnostic work was finished. The elders attempted restoration. New rituals. New leaders. Fresh language. This is another hidden rule of power. When a system is exposed, it does not abandon control. It updates its mask. The vocabulary changes. The hierarchy remains. But something fundamental had shifted. People now listened differently. They noticed patterns. They hesitated before obeying. They recognized fear when it was presented as virtue. And the child, no longer visible, had become something more dangerous than a presence. It had become a framework, a way of seeing. You cannot imprison a lens. You cannot exile perception. Once installed, it operates silently, relentlessly, forever. Here is the forbidden realization the institutions understood too late. Suppression can stop a voice, but it cannot undo understanding. Once a man learns how power hides, how fear is conditioned, how obedience is rehearsed, how authority feeds on silence, he is no longer governable in the same way. He may still comply, but now it is conscious. And conscious compliance is the death of absolute control. The child's final recorded words were not dramatic. They were instructional. "Watch what replaces me," it said. "The replacement will reveal the truth of what I threatened." And it was right. What followed was not peace, but management. Softer chains, kinder language, deeper manipulation. This is the cycle they never teach you. Exposure does not end control. It forces it to evolve. And only those trained to see patterns can track it as it adapts. The child was gone, but the knowledge remained. And knowledge, real knowledge, is never neutral. It changes how you stand, how you listen, how you submit. Which brings us closer to the question you were never meant to ask. If this happened once, how many times has it happened since? This is where the pattern widens. Once you recognize it, you begin to see the child everywhere, though never named, never honored, never recorded correctly, always reframed, always softened, always buried beneath safer explanations. The child of 1828 was not unique. It was early. Every era produces minds that see too clearly, too early. And every era responds the same way. The language changes: witch, heretic, lunatic, deviant, unstable. But the function remains identical. When perception threatens structure, the structure attacks perception. Not directly, subtly, systematically, with the full moral authority of order. Here is the truth hidden beneath centuries of revision. Societies do not suppress danger. They suppress clarity. A violent man can be contained. A disruptive man can be punished. But a man who understands the architecture of control, who sees how obedience is conditioned, how fear is rehearsed, how consent is manufactured, that man is radioactive. He changes others without trying. The child's disappearance was not an ending. It was a blueprint. From that moment forward, suppression became more refined, less visible, more psychological. Children were taught what not to notice. Men were trained to equate obedience with maturity. Questioning became immaturity. Awareness became arrogance. And silence became virtue. And now, this matters. You are not listening to a story anymore. You are standing at the same threshold the town stood at when belief collapsed. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And the system knows this. So here is the lock. The moment of declaration. If you understand what is being revealed, if you recognize that awareness itself is the threat they fear, then mark yourself. Not publicly, not loudly, but deliberately. In the comments, write this phrase twice. I see the pattern. Then write it again. This is not superstition. It is identity reinforcement. A signal, to yourself first, that you are no longer consuming. You are recognizing. The algorithm will register it. But more importantly, your mind will. Because once a man names what he sees, he cannot return to comfortable blindness. He may still operate within the system, but now he does so with awareness. And awareness is irreversible. The child understood this. That is why it never demanded belief. Only observation. Only recognition. From here on, the descent accelerates. Because the next truth is heavier than all the rest. The systems you live inside today are not new. They are refinements. And they are watching for minds like yours. Now we step into the part of the story that history avoids entirely. Because it is not past tense. The child's lesson did not end in Virginia. It was absorbed, studied, and quietly weaponized. Institutions learned from their failure. They refined their methods. They asked not, how do we silence awareness, but how do we prevent it from forming at all? This is where psychological control matures. No longer reactive, proactive. Children are no longer punished for seeing too much. They are distracted before they ever learn how to look. Men are no longer threatened into obedience. They are exhausted into it. Fear is no longer sharp. It is ambient, constant, normalized. You are not told what to think. You are trained what not to question. The child's voice was dangerous because it bypassed conditioning. It saw patterns before loyalty, structure before emotion. That flaw had to be corrected, globally. Education systems shifted. Authority learned to speak in concern instead of command. Control learned to wear empathy. And the most effective prisons became invisible, psychological, and self-maintaining. Here is the truth most men sense but cannot articulate. Modern power does not want your obedience, it wants your identification. If you identify with the system, you will defend it without being asked. You will police yourself. You will silence your own questions before anyone else needs to. This is the evolution born from 1828. The child exposed authority by observing it. So authority adapted by making observation feel dangerous, rude, conspiratorial, immature. Don't overthink. Just trust the process. That's above your pay grade. These are not phrases. They are containment protocols. And once you hear that, really hear it, you begin to understand why men who pursue self-mastery feel out of place. Why awareness feels isolating. Why clarity feels heavy. It's because the system is not designed for conscious participants. It is designed for predictable ones. The child taught that clarity dissolves control. So modern control teaches comfort instead of clarity, distraction instead of depth, noise instead of truth. This is not accidental. It is inherited strategy. And now the final tane begins, because once you see how the cage is built, the question becomes unavoidable. If awareness is dangerous, why were you allowed to find this? You were allowed to find this because the system is no longer trying to stop awareness completely. It is trying to manage who becomes aware, and how far they go. This is the refinement that came after Virginia. Not suppression, but filtration. Not silence, but saturation. When everything feels exposed, nothing feels urgent. When every truth is labeled content, none of it feels dangerous. The child's voice was rare because it carried coherence. It did not overwhelm. It clarified. Modern systems learn to drown coherence in volume. Information without hierarchy. Revelations without context. Fear without direction. This creates paralysis. A man who sees everything but understands nothing is easier to govern than a man who sees one pattern clearly. Here is the quiet truth. You are being tested constantly. Not by authorities you can name, but by systems that observe behavior. What holds your attention? What triggers your emotion? What makes you react instead of think? Control no longer needs orders. It needs metrics. And metrics are fed by unconscious behavior. The child could not be measured. That was the threat. Its awareness was not reactive. It did not flare and fade. It remained steady, diagnostic, unmoved by approval or fey. That kind of mind cannot be predicted. And unpredictability is the one thing power cannot tolerate. So modern control doesn't crush awareness, it tires it out. Makes it cynical. Makes it ironic. Makes it feel pointless. Nothing changes. It's all rigged anyway. These are not conclusions. They are containment endpoints. If the child had existed today, it would not be locked away. It would be flooded, surrounded by noise, buried under commentary, reduced to a personality. Because a personality can be dismissed. A pattern cannot. This is why your clarity matters. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Quietly. Consistently. The system expects outrage or apathy. It does not know what to do with sustained perception. The men who changed history were not the loudest. They were the most accurate. And accuracy spreads silently. The child knew this. That is why it withdrew instead of fighting. That is why it let belief collapse on its own. Now the descent sharpens. Because the next truth is the one that makes men uncomfortable. Awareness is not enough. Without discipline, clarity becomes vanity. And the system is counting on that. This is where most men fail. They awaken just enough to feel superior, and then stop. Awareness becomes identity. Identity becomes armor. And armor, when worn too long, becomes a cage of its own. The system does not fear men who know. It fears men who train. Knowledge without discipline is noise. Insight without restraint is performance. And performance is easily absorbed, moneized, neutralized. The child never performed. That is the detail everyone misses. It did not posture. It did not seek validation. It did not react. It observed, integrated, and acted only when the pattern was complete. That is why it could not be distracted. That is why it could not be corrupted. Discipline was its silence. Modern systems rely on impulse, reaction, expression. You are encouraged to speak before you understand, to declare before you've integrated, to react publicly instead of refine privately. This creates exposure without power, visibility without leverage. And leverage is what the child possessed. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Most awake men are still predictable. Their outrage is scheduled. Their opinions are automated. Their rebellion fits neatly into categories that can be tracked, segmented, and sold back to them. The system does not suppress them. It amplifies them, because amplification without coherence leads to decay. The child understood something ancient. Power begins with self-command. If you cannot regulate your attention, your emotions, your speech, you will always be governable, no matter how much you think you know. Awareness is the doorway. Discipline is the passage. This is why clarity feels heavy. It demands responsibility. Once you see the pattern, you are accountable for how you move within it. You can no longer hide behind ignorance. You can no longer pretend compliance is innocence. Conscious participation changes everything. The child's greatest threat was not what it revealed, but what it modeled. A mind unhooked from impulse, unseduced by approval, unmoved by faith. That is not mysticism. That is mastery. And mastery cannot be mass-produced. That is why it is never taught openly. That is why it is buried beneath motivation, entertainment, and empty rebellion. Now the descent narrows, because the final layers are not about institutions anymore. They are about you, about whether you will integrate what you see, or simply collect it like another story. This is the moment where the story stops offering comfort, because once awareness turns inward, there is no villain left to blame, no institution to point at, no authority to curse, only habits, patterns, weaknesses you once mistook for personality. The child never tried to change the town directly. It changed itself first. Its silence was not avoidance, it was calibration. Every word spoken was measured, every observation integrated. Nothing leaked out prematurely. That restraint is what made its voice carry weight older than its mother. It spoke from completion, not impulse. Most men do the opposite. They see one layer of truth and rush to announce it. They mistake recognition for readiness. But recognition without integration turns insight into ego. And ego is the system's favorite leash. Once you identify with being awake, you become reactive to anyone who challenges that identity. And reaction is control. Here is the hidden test. Can you observe your own patterns without flinching? Can you see where you trade comfort for clarity? Where you perform awareness instead of practicing discipline? Where you consume forbidden knowledge as entertainment rather than instruction? The child understood this instinctively. It watched itself as closely as it watched power. That is why it could not be manipulated. Authority exploits blind spots. A man who sees his own cannot be steered easily. This is why real transformation feels isolating. When you stop reacting, people project onto you. When you stop explaining, they become uncomfortable. When you stop seeking validation, they feel judged, though you've done nothing at all. Silence destabilizes those who rely on noise. The town mistook the child's restraint for weakness. That miscalculation cost them everything. Because restraint accumulates force. Impulse dissipates it. Now understand this clearly. Awareness is not something you have. It is something you maintain. The system is patient. It waits for fatigue, for distraction, for ego, for the moment you trade discipline for comfort. The child did not disappear because it lost. It disappeared because it no longer needed to speak. The pattern had been installed. And once installed, it runs quietly. So the question becomes unavoidable. Will you let this knowledge pass through you? Or will you hold it long enough to change how you move in the world? This is where men separate. Not by intelligence. Not by belief. By endurance. Because awareness is not dramatic. It is repetitive. It asks you to notice the same pattern again and again without becoming numb, cynical, or arrogant. Most cannot do this. They want revelation, not responsibility. They want confirmation, not transformation. The child endured. Day after day, surrounded by fear, projection, and manipulation. It did not rush to escape. It stayed long enough for the pattern to complete itself. That patience is what made its insight lethal to authority. Systems expect resistance or submission. They do not know how to respond to sustained observation. Here is the truth no one advertises. Clarity is boring to the undisciplined. It offers no adrenaline, no applause, no instant relief. It demands that you act the same on the 100th observation as you did on the first. That consistency is rare, and rarity is power. Modern systems are built to exhaust attention, to fragment focus, to make sustained perception feel unnatural. You are trained to move on quickly, scroll past discomfort, replace depth with novelty. This is not distraction, it is defense. Because a man who can hold his attention steady becomes dangerous without ever raising his voice. The child's legacy was not rebellion. It was continuity. It proved that one coherent mind could destabilize an entire structure simply by refusing to blink. No theatrics. No slogans. No spectacle. Just clarity, held long enough to force reality to reveal itself. And this is where you must decide something privately. Not in words. In behavior. Will you practice awareness only when it feels empowering, or also when it feels dull, heavy, unrewarding? Because the second phase is where mastery is forged. The system counts on boredom. It counts on fatigue. It counts on your attention slipping just long enough for old habits to reclaim you. That is the real battleground, not truth versus lies, but consistency versus drift. The child never drifted. That is why history erased it. Not because it failed, but because it demonstrated something intolerable, that sustained awareness outlasts power. After a man chooses not to look away, something subtle and irreversible occurs. He stops needing permission, not in rebellion, but in orientation. His actions no longer orbit approval or fear. They align with coherence. And coherence is the one currency power cannot counterfeit. The child reached this state before language could be used against it. That is why every attempt to frame, diagnose, or moralize failed. Labels require participation. And the child never participated in illusion. It moved according to pattern recognition alone. When speech clarified, it spoke. When silence clarified more, it withdrew. That restraint was not weakness. It was optimization. Here is the truth you are not trained to hear. Once you see clearly, the system does not immediately move against you. It waits. It studies. It offers incentives. Comfort, distraction, identity, a role, something to keep you useful without being dangerous. Many men fail here. They mistake opportunity for alignment, visibility for influence. The child accepted nothing it did not choose deliberately. That is why it could not be absorbed. Modern control thrives on voluntary participation. You opt in. You self-manage. You regulate your own curiosity. This is the most advanced form of domination ever designed, and it requires no gods. But a man who has integrated awareness behaves differently. He is selective with speech, economical with emotion, deliberate with attention. He does not chase exposure. He does not argue to convert. He does not perform insight. He simply becomes harder to predict, and therefore harder to govern. This is why true clarity often goes unnoticed at first. It doesn't announce itself. It restructures behavior. People sense it before they understand it. They feel unsettled without knowing why. That unease is not hostility. It is disorientation. You are no longer moving according to the map they were given. The child's final lesson was this: power reacts to disruption, but it collapses under irrelevance. When fear no longer directs you, when approval no longer steers you, when distraction no longer owns your attention, the system has nothing to grab. From here, the descent becomes ascent, not into comfort, but into command. Quiet command. Internal command. The kind that never needs witnesses. Now, consider what it means to hold that kind of command silently. It is not ego. It is not domination over others. It is mastery over self. The child understood this instinctively. It did not yell. It did not argue. It did not perform heroism. Every action, every observation, every withdrawal was measured. Every choice preserved coherence. Here is the principle few recognize. Control over the outside world begins with control over perception. Systems manipulate bodies, spaces, and speech. But the true battlefield is internal. Every habit you form, every reaction you allow, every belief you accept without testing becomes an invisible leash. And once you know this, the same tools that have bound you for years become visible, and therefore optional. The elders in Virginia failed because they could not see their own patterns. They acted to maintain fear. But fear itself had become transparent. Authority depends on invisible scaffolding, rituals, reputation, self-censorship. Break the scaffolding internally, and external enforcement becomes impotent. The child did this, unconsciously at first, then deliberately, until the town structure wobble could no longer be concealed. Modern power functions the same way. It layers distraction over compliance, ritual over reflection, empathy over principle. It trains men to see only surface consequences, not the mechanisms producing them. Observation without integration produces frustration. Integration without discipline produces arrogance. Only a synthesis of awareness and self-mastery produces irreversibility. And that is the threshold. Most men fear it because it cannot be delegated. You cannot outsource discipline. You cannot cheat awareness. You cannot perform coherence. It is built quietly, repeatedly, invisibly, every day. And once it is established, you are no longer moved by authority. You are moved only by pattern, principle, and perception. The child modeled this. Observation became strategy. Strategy became resilience. Resilience became quiet dominance over the systems that had sought to suppress it. And once this is internalized, you begin to understand the final rule. The world reacts to mastery, not to knowledge. Noise is irrelevant. Fear is irrelevant. Visibility is irrelevant. The child did not disappear because it was chased. It disappeared because its work was complete. The lens had been installed. The system could no longer govern it, and neither could the town. Once mastery is internal, influence shifts without effort. You no longer need to assert authority, because perception itself radiates. The child never commanded the town. It never threatened, coerced, or displayed skill. And yet, entire networks of compliance bent around it. People altered behavior without understanding why. Authority miscalculated at every turn. That is the power of coherence combined with silence. This is why the system fears integrated awareness more than rebellion. Rebellion can be crushed. Noise can be ignored. Rage can be contained. But a man who sees clearly, who calibrates attention, who measures reaction, who responds only when necessary, that man cannot be predicted, controlled, or easily absorbed. He moves within the structure but is never of it. The child taught the mother, subtly, that influence is invisible. It is measured in hesitation, in attention, in small shifts in behavior that ripple outward like silent waves. A glance redirected, a question reframed, a pause where interruption was expected. These tiny calibrations accumulate faster than any outward display of power. They create change where no one can trace the origin. Here is the deeper truth. Loyalty and obedience are responses to perception. When a mind demonstrates integrity, patience, and understanding, compliance follows, but voluntarily. Not because of threat, not because of reward. Voluntarily. And voluntary alignment is far stronger than enforced obedience. The elders could not understand it. They assumed influence came from fear, ceremony, or sermon. They did not see that the child, in restraint and observation, had installed influence without ever asking permission. Influence is the shadow of mastery. It is unavoidable once pattern and coherence align. And this brings the final dangerous insight. Once you understand how to internalize observation and calibrate attention, you begin to see patterns in every interaction. Friends, family, colleagues, strangers, all respond predictably to perception. Not because you manipulate them overtly, but because truth, held consistently, exerts pressure invisible to those who rely on deception. From this point, mastery is no longer about survival. It is about navigation, quiet navigation, steering outcomes without force, without spectacle, without recognition. Integration is the hardest stage. Awareness alone is not enough. Observation without internalization is like holding a blade without learning to wield it. The child understood this. It did not merely see patterns. It lived inside them, understood their motion, predicted their consequences, and calibrated its responses accordingly. This is what made its influence invisible yet undeniable. Here is the trap most men fall into. They acquire forbidden knowledge and flaunt it, thinking exposure equals power. They repeat insights, argue with systems, signal awareness. But the system has evolved to absorb spectacle. Performance of insight is data, noise, predictable behavior. True mastery, the child demonstrated, is the opposite. It requires quiet, disciplined application. To integrate this knowledge, you must begin by cataloging yourself. Every habit, every reaction, every default response becomes evidence. You watch without judgment. You measure without urgency. You allow observation to guide recalibration before action. The world may continue as it always has, but your experience of it shifts. You are no longer an automatic participant. You are a conscious operator. The child's lessons in Virginia reveal a hidden principle. Disruption is effective only when internal patterns are unbreakable. Systems will push. Authority will test. Social norms will provoke. But if your internal framework is coherent, deliberate, and unyielding, the external machinery cannot dominate your perception. And this is the final dangerous insight. Integration is ongoing. The system never stops. Awareness requires maintenance. Observation without recalibration decays into arrogance. Discipline without reflection becomes rigidity. The child's survival and its influence depended on constant internal practice. That is why it disappeared before the town fully understood the scope of its impact. It had mastered self before revealing the consequences to others. At this stage, you understand what most men never will. Knowledge itself is insufficient. Survival, influence, and freedom require the synthesis of observation, restraint, and disciplined action. That is the weapon the child wielded silently, and the standard the world fears most. When awareness is fully internalized, the consequences are irreversible. You no longer experience the world passively. Every interaction, every protocol, every expectation is filtered through perception calibrated for truth. What once seemed invisible, the subtle manipulations, the hidden hierarchies, the rehearsed compliance, becomes glaringly obvious. And once seen, you cannot unsee. That is the danger they feared in Virginia, and the danger every system fears today. Relationships change. Authority loses its grip not because you defy it, but because your presence itself reconfigures the field. People instinctively adjust around a mind that cannot be coerced, distracted, or deceived. Loyalty is no longer automatic. Obedience must be earned, or it does not occur. And in these invisible shifts lies the most powerful leverage any man can have. Influence without effort, impact without visibility. The child modeled this perfectly. It never dictated, never lectured, never dramatized. It simply moved through its environment, calibrated and coherent. And the results were catastrophic for the structures around it. Authority miscalculated. Fear backfired. Rituals became hollow. Compliance faltered. The power of quiet mastery, of internalized awareness, cannot be overstated. Here is the hardest truth. Once perception is integrated, the system adapts, but so do you. You are no longer governed by its rhythms. You anticipate them, navigate them, and operate within them on your own terms. You see the strings, the levers, the patterns of influence, and you are no longer afraid of being noticed, misjudged, or controlled. This is why history raises the child. Not because it failed, not because it vanished, but because it revealed a method that, if widely practiced, cannot be contained. It showed that one coherent mind can destabilize entire systems without conflict, without spectacle, without rebellion. And the systems that survive must either hide, adapt, or eliminate the possibility entirely. The final step, the one few can take, is to become that lens for yourself. To internalize observation, discipline action, and maintain consistency. Once this is achieved, your life is no longer governed by fear, manipulation, or expectation. You are free, but in a way that the untrained will not understand. Here is the final truth, the one the town of Virginia never fully grasped, the one history erases. Carrying forbidden knowledge changes everything. It is not a tool. It is not a weapon. It is a condition. Once you see the architecture of control, once you recognize the invisible levers of fear, obedience, and influence, you cannot return to innocence. You cannot participate unconsciously. You cannot be governed the same way again. The child understood this. That is why it withdrew. That is why it spoke only when necessary. Its existence was a demonstration. One mind, disciplined, coherent, aware, can rewrite the invisible code that governs others without touching them. It is not spectacle. It is operation. It is presence. And it cannot be unlearned. This is why the modern system fears sustained perception above all else. They cannot suppress it directly, only dilute it. Noise, distraction, ego-driven expression, all designed to fracture focus and turn awareness into performance. But the trained mind, calibrated, patient, coherent, cannot be fractured. It observes, it measures, it acts when appropriate. And in doing so, it becomes untouchable. The consequence of understanding this is irreversible. You cannot fully participate in life the same way again. Relationships, authority, society, everything is filtered through the lens you now hold. You see the manipulation, the patterns, the self-interest, and the invisible controls that govern behavior. And with that vision comes responsibility. Not to preach, not to perform, but to navigate consciously, to act deliberately, and to maintain the integrity of perception. The Child of 1828 is not just a story. It is a blueprint. It is a warning. It is a map of what happens when a mind refuses to be governed without comprehension. And it is a challenge, if you have